Hi, everybody. I'm Jodi Rudoren, editor-in-chief of The Forward, and thanks for joining us. Today was a day that started out really terrible in the Middle East as we woke up and we looked to the clashes happening in Jerusalem, and it just got worse and worse. In the middle of our editorial meeting today, everyone got alerts on their phones that there were sirens going off, not in Jerusalem, from a barrage of rocket fire coming from the Gaza Strip. And by the time we decided to plan this live chat, we had heard of Israel retaliating with airstrikes on Gaza. The Palestinian officials say that some 20 people have been killed in those airstrikes, 9 of them children. And it's just another kind of devastating, horrific day in which these tensions and clashes that all of us have covered and read about for years are flaring up again. So I'm joined tonight by 2 of our amazing journalists, actually both news staffers to The Forward. Laura Adkins, our opinion editor, is literally her first day as opinion editor at The Forward. She jumped right in to a big news day. And Jacob Kornbluh, our senior political correspondent, whose 120th day at The Forward is tomorrow. All of us have a lot of experience covering the Middle East and the conflict there. I was the bureau chief for the New York Times based in Jerusalem for 4 years. And I'll tell you, so many of the elements from today are things I have written about myself, 8, 7, 6 years ago. I want to ask you, Jacob, though, it's like we have so many of these elements that are familiar, these cycles that we always cover in some of these stories, but there are some underlying dynamics right now this year that are a little bit different. And I'd love you to start walking us through them.
So first of all, Israel had a relatively calm, security-wise, a very calm situation the last 2 years, despite the political deadlock. Some would suggest that usually in times of turmoil, political turmoil, you're not able to conduct the same security cabinet meetings and consultations, and your enemies see you as weak. But it was really the opposite. And some contributed that to sort of not only a lack of strategy, but also as a time-ticking bomb, that it would come eventually because the situation is just unsustainable. I don't think people expected it to come at that level. I mean, everything got out of hand, sort of. The tension in Jerusalem, I mean, every year you sort of have that Jerusalem Day celebrations. This year, obviously, it converged together with the end of Ramadan. And you also had elections in Israel where far-right extremist party came to power, and they're sort of serving as a representative of the more extreme settler movement. But nobody expected the flare-up to happen for both sides. Israel right now is in sort of a transition between 2 governments, either a continuation of the Netanyahu government or a new change government. And in Gaza, elections were supposed to take place. They were obviously postponed, but Hamas is sort of seeking to become more political rather than militant. And so it's just something that went out of hand, unexpected, but anticipated.
Laura, what do you see here that looks a little different for you from other times when you've watched this kind of thing happen?
I mean, something that's very stark to me is the 3 of us have a very zoomed out view here in America. Like literally, I'm watching the very disturbing video of Jewish individuals gathered at the Western Wall, singing and dancing, celebrating Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day, while literally, 100 feet above their heads, you see a fire. And we can see that zoomed out view. But when you're actually in Israel, sometimes those disparate parts really feel disconnected from each other, and the narratives are very disconnected from each other. So what seems very different this time to me is just so many things that are always simmering are happening at the same time. You have Ramadan, when Muslim individuals go to what we consider the Temple Mount, what to them is one of the holiest sites in Islam. You have Jerusalem Day, which is always a tension point for residents of Jerusalem. You have the evictions that are pending in East Jerusalem. And we really take for granted, as you mentioned, these periods of calm. The norm recently has actually been Hamas and Israel trading rocket fire a lot. So I think those three simmering things all kind of came to a flashpoint today. And it's just bad timing.
I want to zoom out even more, Laura, because I don't think that many people in America necessarily even know about Jerusalem Day. I'm not sure that I did. And I just want to tell a quick story. When I first moved to Jerusalem to be the bureau chief back in 2012, I first went for a few weeks without my family, and it was around this time of year to kind of settle in. And I got connected up to this like insane, really cool poker game that had actually never had a woman player before. It was all these expats. And we played the night before Jerusalem Day, which was like not a holiday that I really knew much about. And one guy at the table said, he's like, I don't understand why Jerusalem Day isn't a bigger deal across the Jewish world. This was the biggest miracle that ever happened. It was much bigger than the miracle of Esther. He started talking about how at West Point they don't, and sorry, I should just say, Jerusalem Day commemorates the anniversary of when Israeli paratroopers took back the Western Wall in the old city of Jerusalem, and when the occupation began of the East Jerusalem and the West Bank. So this guy was like, they don't even teach it at West Point because they say they can't explain the military success of the 6-Day War. And that was his position. This should be this huge chag, this huge yontif for the Jews all around. And why don't people talk about it more? And then this other guy at the table said, I totally disagree. This was like the worst thing that happened to the Jewish people. The source of all of our problems is from this day. This is the most complicated holiday. It's this whole, dual narratives, two sides. This is all of our problems stem from this occupation that now is past 50 years old. And I was like sitting there listening. I didn't really know much about it. And then the next day I went out to cover Jerusalem Day, and I went to the Damascus Gate where Israeli police were holding back all these Palestinians from entering. And then I went inside the old city, and there were all these young men who frankly looked and sounded like a lot of people I went to camp with. And they were singing a lot of songs that I was familiar with from my Jewish summer camps, but they were doing it like with their arms around each other's shoulders in these tight circles, very aggressively, like to keep the Palestinians out of this space. And it was suddenly this thing that I had, it was like this transformation in my mind of how a kind of Zionist song, a kind of what I thought was a fairly like blasé song about loving Israel and supporting the Jewish state, was a battle cry for them, and there were opposition to it. And I, again, didn't even know Jerusalem Day really existed. And then suddenly I understood that it was this incredibly tense, oppositional day. And I think that, it's a metaphor for so much of what goes on there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think also our narratives don't really leave much space for one another, right? Like it may seem aggressive and confrontational from the outside, and I think many Palestinians probably view it that way. But I think also a lot of these young men and women are just caught up in this genuine, infectious joy of Zionism and the reclamation of the holiest site in Judaism, without ever having contextualized what that means for non-Jews who live in this area. Jerusalem in particular has gone back and forth myriad times over the centuries, even in the most recent century, changed hands several times. So I think for a lot of young Jews, it is a genuine celebration of reclaiming the holiest site. And I don't think many even consider the fact that that has also meant the displacement or inconveniencing and sometimes even death of others.
Right. And what you were talking about earlier about these evictions in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of East Jerusalem, this is a neighborhood that leads directly up to the old city and to the area that many Jews think of as the city of David. Many of us have gone on these tours of the city of David and learned about the biblical history of how it was used to bring water up to the old city. And that's exactly where these conflicts are over who should, whether people can retain the houses that they've been in for a long time, but obviously not back to those times. Jacob, have you been there for Jerusalem Day? Do you have any?
Yeah, I actually recall the first year coming to Israel. My yeshiva was a few blocks away from Merkaz Arav, where the annual celebration is, and that's the first time I actually came to see Prime Minister Netanyahu, and we're talking about 22 years ago. Okay, it's just the flashbacks of seeing the Prime Minister then running for re-election and now potentially being replaced. But I think to touch on your point, yes, Jerusalem is a consensus issue, right? We all speak about the unification of Jerusalem actually being the capital of Israel, and there's almost no, even on the left, Labor even and Meretz, they consider Jerusalem to be, so the unification of Jerusalem, not only West Jerusalem, but also East Jerusalem, as something that belongs to Israel. But when you look at the celebrations, it's mostly the religious Zionists who rejoice. You don't see Haredi, ultra-Orthodox, the Lithuanian community, or the Sephardic community, or even in general secular Israelis who in Yom Ha'atzmaut, on Independence Day, you see them in the parks doing the barbecues. You don't see them celebrating this holiday the same way you would expect if it would be something so unique, the reunification of the capital of Israel. So I think that is where the tension is, because at the end, you come down to the core of the conflict. The conflict is a religious one. It's not only about territory. It's obviously, about the occupation of the Palestinian people in the West Bank, but it's also a religious issue about Al-Quds, about Jerusalem. And so when you put these two together, you bring the religious Zionists, who for them, it's sort of Zionism is sort of a religion. It's not only the acceptance of creating this Jewish state in the land of Israel, and you have obviously now Ramadan, but the Muslims in their holy site sort of all coming together. That's what creates the conflict.
Of course, religious Zionists is sort of the Israeli term for modern Orthodox, but it's also really the lead movement in the settler movement, politically at least, and many of the settlers are religious Zionists. If you have questions or comments that you want to share in the chat, please do comment on Facebook, and we will take any questions that you have. Also check out forward.com for Jacob's analytical piece, which is going up soon, some opinion pieces that Laura's been editing. And I guess we should start to think about what we think is going to happen next. I mean, we know so Israel has retaliated with these airstrikes overnight. The U.S. has said they're watching the situation carefully, has condemned violence. I think we're going to see more and more calls for calm from both sides. The likelihood is that Hamas may continue rocket fire, or maybe there'll be a ceasefire. But what do you guys think will happen next? What are you watching for tomorrow?
I expect this to go on for at least a couple of days. Obviously, Egypt is already mediating and seeking to tamp down. You'll have obviously the Biden administration try to manage this. But again, you always have to take in the politics and also take the moment. The moment right now of transition is also something that Netanyahu feels that he can just not let this go by without a harsh response, but he also has the political backing of all the parties in Israel because Gaza is such a fluid situation. And so, I mean, give it a day or two and you'll already consider the UN and Egypt brokering some sort of ceasefire. The onus will be on Hamas. If they are not interested in broadening this conflict, they will stop the rocket fire, and in return, Israel will stop the airstrikes.
Do you think, I mean, Netanyahu is a leader who has thrived on fear and on security issues. Do you think that just to catch people up who haven't been paying super close attention, but after the fourth election in 2 years on March 3rd, Netanyahu had the opportunity to form a government. A month has passed, and he could not put together a coalition of 61 of the 120 Knesset members. So that opportunity has now passed to somebody else. But do you think there's a chance that this escalation will lead to some kind of new opportunity somehow for Netanyahu to stay, and that he'll use this to his advantage? Either of you?
Yeah, I mean, the reason why some in the change bloc, as they call the anti-Bibi bloc, urged Yair Lapid and Bennett to sort of close the deal and announce that they've managed to form a government is because the power of incumbency. As long as Netanyahu is still in office, he can sort of try and disrupt. Yair Lapid has 22 days to come back to the president and say, I have formed the government. Reports are that they intended to do it tonight. Okay, so they were sort of almost getting together all the parties and getting the support of the joint Arab list. What's happening right now is, as much as this situation broadens and we see a full-fledged military campaign in Gaza, the less likely is that the joint list will actually want to join a government, even if it's not headed by Netanyahu, because in the end, it's not only the Knesset member Mansour Abbas, who is the leader of that party, who calls the shots. It's actually sort of they have sort of the same as we have the Mo'etzet in Agudas Israel and Shas, the Torah sages who actually call the shots. And if this becomes a religious issue, if this becomes about the Palestinian people, it would be very hard to convince that they should be part of the political process. But also, if this drags on 3 weeks, we're already talking about more than the 22 days that is given by Yair Lapid. In that case, it returns to the Knesset. And in that situation, anybody who comes up with 61 signatures gets to form a government. That's when Netanyahu can offer rotation to somebody else, and he just remains alternate prime minister, but still remains relevant on the scene. So things can happen, but again, if in 2 days we see a ceasefire and the parties resume political negotiations, we could see a government be formed by next week.
Right. I think no matter whether Netanyahu remains prime minister, which looks unlikely, but you never know with him, whether or not that happens, this last few days of chaos really adds fuel to both hardline players on both sides, and more significantly, when it comes to forming a government, the solidly right-wing constituencies who say, look, this is why we will never have peace with Palestinians. This is why it was insane for you to think that the joint list is a partner that you should build a government with. And I mean, on both sides, you will see also a hardening along the lines of Palestinian militant entities. Anytime there's a big flare-up like this, historically, we really see a hardening and a polarization within both Palestinian and Israeli society. It usually benefits the incumbent, but also it's what led to Hamas's election in the first place. So it's not looking great for the peace process, whatever that means. But more significantly, this would have been, we'll see if it happens, but this would have been the first Israeli government that had the joint Arab list as a partner. And Arab Israelis are 20% of the society, yet don't really have a hand in the leadership historically. So I think it's very unfortunate that this is all coming together at the same time.
Right. So the images that you were seeing, and thank you very much to our wonderful news director, Benjamin Cohen, behind the scenes, who's putting that up. So we showed obviously Israelis, Netanyahu and his wife voting, but also then President Reuven Rivlin meeting with Yair Lapid, offering him, as Jacob described, the mandate to form a government, and then also meeting with Naftali Bennett, who Lapid has made a deal with to offer Naftali Bennett the first turn in the prime minister's chair under this unity government. But this idea of this unity government is literally a bunch of people who really do not agree on anything other than that they don't want Netanyahu to be prime minister. They're going to agree to sit together and also agree, right, not to basically do anything on the issues they disagree about, which include the Israeli-Palestinian question, what to do about the West Bank, and also like religious pluralism issues. So they were going to focus on the economy, essentially. So the idea that you can now form a government days after all of this blew up that would avowedly not tackle these issues does feel a little hard to imagine. Although I understand they are kind of out of options, but it's a little hard to imagine how, especially as you said, the Arab parties, Labor and Meretz, how they're going to join in with Naftali Bennett, with Gidon Saar, the former Likud leader who's formed his own right-wing party. It just feels, with Avigdor Lieberman, who wants to blow Hamas out of Gaza. I mean, it's really...
I would suggest that Naftali Bennett's premiership was the first Israeli casualty of this flare-up.
So, yeah, right. So, in other words, that people will say they'll only do it if Lapid will be first.
Right. I mean, the Arabs could still potentially both, only if you get both Arab parties or for them to abstain, they could potentially still support a government without Bennett. But then you need Lieberman, Gantz, and Gidon Saar. But then Lapid can go to Gidon Saar and to Gantz and tell them, how about I give you that rotation offer? Let's leave Bennett on the outside, just because these two parties, sort of the Yamina, the right-wing party, can just not sit in one government with a joint.
But of course, Gantz is the defense minister, so he's like the face of the rockets
right.
that of the airstrikes that are killing the Palestinians overnight. So
yeah,
Lapid ain't a leftist,
At Lapid, though, it seems like it sounds like you think. It seems like Lapid basically does not want to be first because he knows whoever runs this coalition government it's going to be a disaster, right? There's no chance of it actually working. So he's like, let someone else take the hit. Let's get rid of Netanyahu, and then I'll wait in the wings as the guy who made it and run afterwards.
I don't think that he just doesn't want. I mean, he obviously wants to be prime minister. Everybody wants to be in that position of power. I just think that he made a tactical decision, that his path towards a premiership goes through Naftali Bennett, because that's the only way how you break up sort of the pro-Netanyahu bloc, because Naftali Bennett was the last resort in Netanyahu's ability to actually form a government without the support of Lieberman and Gidon Saar. And so I believe that Yair Lapid just made, it's part of his strategy. He didn't run for prime minister. He even mocked Netanyahu for suggesting that he was running for prime minister. I'm not running for prime minister. And that was a strategy just to make sure that the bloc gains a majority. His next step is obviously to lead that bloc. And even though he's only alternate prime minister, even though he only enters the prime minister's residence and office in 2 years from now, he's not even certain that this government is going to hold on. I mean, I don't see, even if they swear in the government next week and everything goes rosy and they have a honeymoon and they pass a budget, I don't see it ending its term, its 4-year term. And so where does Yair Lapid come in? First of all, he sort of is the largest party in that bloc, so he controls the agenda. He has obviously veto power, but also he wants that acknowledgement that he's the one who got rid of Netanyahu. And for that, he believes that in the next election, voters will actually reward him by granting him the power to actually become prime minister.
I don't know how much this hurts Naftali Bennett also. I mean, the key constituency that we saw dancing and cheering at the Western Wall, those are Naftali Bennett's people, right? Most Jews who align with the religious Zionist community don't necessarily focus today on the Palestinian casualties. They focus on what they see as Palestinian violence, the rocket attacks from Hamas. And I think Naftali Bennett can very easily pivot this as we're getting the government response ready, everything's going to be under control. Look how well we took care of the aftermath of this. And again, I wouldn't say that there are very many figures within Israeli politics that you can characterize as being lefty. It's kind of an insult in Israeli society. So as you mentioned, like Benny Gantz is the one tweeting about how we're going to come down really hard on the Palestinian terror attacks. It's not quite as simple as it is in the U.S. to divide people along traditional left-right politics.
So I've been asking you guys for a lot of answers, but I wonder also about your questions. Like, where are you headed next with your reporting or your assigning? You can give up some trade secrets, but like, what are the burning questions you have now that you would want to pursue tomorrow? Although we can start with Jacob responding to what Laura said just a second ago. Sorry to jump ahead.
I just believe that again, knowing Naftali Bennett, it's always about the alibi. Why is he joining that government? Why is he committed to take Netanyahu out of office? He doesn't say it's because Netanyahu is corrupt, which we all believe he is. He doesn't say it's because Netanyahu has been in power for so long that it's time to give over the mantle to somebody else. He says, I gave him a chance. He failed. Give me that chance in order not to drag Israel into another election season. Guess what? If Israel goes to an election, either in a week from now or in 6 months from now, Naftali Bennett won't even meet the threshold. Not because Naftali Bennett won't be a success as prime minister, but he sees it as if, let me at least be part of that leadership for the next 2 years, and then I'll go into retirement even though I'm still young, because I at least managed to sort of lead Israel out of political deadlock. But he knows, poll came out 2 days ago, shows that over 60% of his own base, which is only 4 seats, but without this 4 seats, he only has 2.5 seats, which doesn't meet the threshold. 62% are against him doing this in order to solve the political crisis. So until now, it was the alibi of saying, here's why I'm doing it, because there's a political crisis. But now he has no incentive to join a government that will restrain him from actually implementing the policies he believes in. And among those policies is crush Hamas. Among those policies is to pursue policies that would sort of sustain, at least, he's saying, let me at least sustain the status quo that is now, which we all know the status quo is unsustainable, but they say, let's first resolve this political deadlock, and then we'll deal along the way with this conflict. And that's why I think that he's the first casualty, because even though Lapid is still committed to this offer, I see it very hard for Naftali Bennett. When he will actually sign that piece of paper, his hands will tremble. I don't see him signing right now a coalition agreement that puts him together with these 7 parties, because he has no incentive, but also he knows it's unmanageable.
What say you, Laura?
Yeah, you asked what we're watching. There's 2 very different things that I am watching with bated breath, I suppose. The first, Kerem Shalom, which is the main crossing point into Gaza, that on a good day, I've been there, involves like a very complicated screening process of getting humanitarian goods to Gazans from Israel. That's obviously a very fraught location, but it was totally closed today due to Israeli governmental concerns of the danger of letting goods through. But Israel controls whether or not Gaza gets anything into the area. So if that continues for a significant period of time, I think things are going to get worse and worse, both for the Gazans who are suffering, and the retaliation attacks from Hamas are going to go up significantly. So I'm watching that very closely. And number 2, I think I'm watching a lot of the religious Zionist leaders I mean, not in a political sense, in a religious community sense, to see what the response will be. And if it's more along the lines of aiming for calm and peace and decrying violence, or if it's continuing to rile people up. I think it's really unclear which way it will go right now.
I think we have a question from the audience, so we'll take that. Benjamin will. Yeah, which is going to be the next thing I was going to ask Jacob anyway. So great question, audience. Thank you so much. And thanks, Benjamin. Jacob, first of all, we know that President Biden didn't really have any Mideast plans, right? Certainly not about Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He hasn't named an ambassador. He's like, I don't want to be involved over there. I'm focused on the infrastructure plan. I'm focused on the pandemic. I'm taking troops out of Afghanistan, and that's causing problems. So how does this mess things up for Biden?
It messes things up because he didn't want to enter that sort of kindergarten. He just thinks that, by focusing on global affairs and actually getting us back, rebuild the economy and in the post-COVID era is actually something that cements his legacy. It's not like President Obama, who his legacy was solving the Middle East conflict. It's not like President Trump, who saw an opportunity of sort of created by some players in the region and just went for it. Right now, there's no opportunity in solving this, even if he would establish a team of negotiators. First of all, you have Netanyahu and Abbas, who are sort of part of the problem. And as long as there's no change in either leadership in Israel and in the Palestinian Authority, there's no way of bringing the two sides to the table. So I don't even see them, trying to draft something that would later formulate into a plan other than build upon the Abraham Accords. And again, the Abraham Accords, it has to be said, doesn't talk about resolving the core issues of the Middle East conflict. The core issues are obviously Jerusalem and the settlements in the West Bank and the refugees, obviously, and the money to the blockade on Gaza and so on. All these things are sort of right now put aside by the leadership of Israel. And again, if a new government is created in Israel, that government is not going to touch this issue, because this is the only issue that could break up the makeup of that government. So right now, what the Biden administration will probably do is sort of create a regional team of experts who can manage this crisis, who can at least contain it, and make sure that Israel understands that, number one, it cannot take unilateral steps out of the broader sense of managing the status quo. And the Palestinian Authority will see that the U.S. administration is actually looking to restore U.S.-Palestinian relations, restore funding to UNRWA, restore funding to the Palestinian Authority on a humanitarian basis. And therefore, their incentive, obviously, is to work with the Biden administration. These are the first steps that the Biden administration will actually do to sort of contain any further escalation. But I don't see any plan of even going close towards restoring even indirect talks between Israel and the Palestinians.
I do think that this is going to make things very complicated also for the Democratic Party vis-a-vis the more progressive wing. The progressive flank of the party, as many of you probably have seen on Twitter and Facebook, is decrying the violence Israel is committing against the Palestinians. And this group within the Democratic Party is a very significant voter group that is only growing in size. It's the youngest group. And I think it's just going to make it more difficult for any move the Biden administration or Congress want to take vis-a-vis aid to Israel, or I don't even know if peace negotiations are going to be on the table, as Jacob said, in the foreseeable future. But
it's so interesting, Laura. Sorry to cut you off, but I just want to, this weekend, I was watching these statements come in over the Sheikh Jarrah evictions. And which were the evictions from this East Jerusalem neighborhood that were slated to happen on Sunday until the Israeli court postponed them. And I was very surprised at how much like mainstream Democratic groups and individuals were condemning them and saying it was a bad idea in a way that we were used to hearing really more from those progressive politicians that you mentioned. And it seemed to me that there was an interesting shift happening in which a more mainstream Democratic position was moving to the left, or to be more supportive or outspokenly supportive of the Palestinian position and urging restraint by Israel. And I was actually talked to Jacob about coming in this morning and trying to do a story analyzing if there was really a significant shift happening and why. And then by the time this morning came around, everything had really changed. And I feel like what you said earlier about the ways in which these kinds of clashes tend to polarize people more, I think is likely to, we'll see, we haven't seen that much in terms of statements from, I don't think, individual politicians or groups since the kind of real escalation with Gaza. But I think that, right, it's going to be very hard for progressives to do anything other than condemn the deaths of the Palestinians. It's going to be very difficult for the more centrist Democrats and establishment Democratic groups or Jewish groups to do anything other than condemn the rockets into Israel, that some of which were aimed even at Jerusalem and Rishon LeZion. So I feel like what you're saying is particularly interesting now when we were seeing, I thought, a little bit of a shift.
Right. It's trickier also, right? Like the evictions seem so clearly easy to denounce because it's not framed as, if we don't evict these people, it means less place for Jews to live in the sacred ancestral homeland. This is how it affects the demographics of the city, et cetera, et cetera. It's simply framed as the immediate tension, which is these people are getting evicted. Right now is a totally different situation. You have rockets flying in both directions. And I mean, for me personally, it sounds cliche, but my heart is breaking for both sides. Like, as a Jew and as a human and as someone very invested in this region, it's hard to quote unquote pick a side, right? This is a cycle of violence that is perpetuated by lots of different things. And unlike the evictions, which seem like elusively concrete, they're not actually, but this really brings to light how complicated and interconnected violence in this region is. So I think, honestly, it's pretty easy for American Jewish groups to put out a statement against evictions. It's much more difficult when you have, as you mentioned, rockets heading towards Israel, but also a lot of people under rocket fire in the Palestinian territories as well.
So we are going to wrap this up in just a sec here. If there's any more questions from the audience, we'll take them. But I do want to say, so there have been 3 times in the last dozen years in which a situation like this went to the next level and became essentially an all-out war. 2008-9, 2012, and 2014. I was in Jerusalem and on the ground in Gaza for both of those last 2 wars. I think nobody seems to think yet that this is headed in that direction for many of the reasons that we've been talking about. So I want to just say that if you all have any different thoughts, you're welcome to air them while Binyamin puts another audience question up for us to tackle.
Yeah, I just quickly, while we look at the question, I do want to say, though, it's still not clear what's going to happen. Like in 2014, I was also in Israel, and I remember when the 3 Israeli teenagers were kidnapped, and we later found out were very quickly killed, but it was used as an excuse to go into Gaza. And I think that it plays to, unfortunately, the Israeli government's advantage to have one of those unifying for Israelis movements to go, quote unquote, root out terror in Gaza. So unfortunately, I don't know if we can write off the idea of that happening yet.
Let's bring back that question one more time. And it's from our own colleague, PJ. Thank you for this question. PJ is a culture reporter at The Forward. So Jacob, what do you think? Apart from the coalition building issues, how do you think this is going to change the political temperature? I mean, I think we've been talking about this a little bit, but let's hone in on it. Is it going to move the needle? We've had 4 elections in which we've essentially had the same result, which is a very deeply divided country on all of the critically important issues. You think this is going to change anything about I mean, he's asking 2 things, right? The political temperature. I think, yes, it does change that, right? It's getting hotter. But does it move the needle at all in a meaningful way of where we end up?
It moves the needle in 2 ways, in 2 scenarios, obviously. If Netanyahu gets out of office, a new government is formed, as I mentioned, putting this issue on the table will create tension and instability. And so it might not happen right away. It will happen in 3 months from now, in 4 months from now. But sort of this gives sort of some political lifeline to Netanyahu, even in opposition. Because for him, remaining in opposition for 4 months is fine as long as he makes a comeback. Obviously, they can still pass a law that prohibits him from running. They could still pass a law that sort of limits the time one can serve as prime minister, and sort of you can form another government under indictment. There's so many things they can play with, but obviously this gives him some political lifeline. If there's another election, that's where this comes into play. Because I think I mentioned it on a Zoom call we hosted. You asked me, what do you predict will the outcome be? I said, it's very hard for me to predict this time because I've been following Netanyahu since he came into power in 1996. And sort of all his victories come by dominating the diplomatic achievements of his government, by dominating the field with his security credentials. Once Israelis were sort of talking about COVID, about the economy, about domestic issues, that's where he lost his grip over his base. That's why he failed to make this sort of a binary choice between himself and Lapid, who he labeled as a lefty, because Israelis were saying the situation is so effed up that we really need to sort of figure out how do we deal with domestic issues, how do we deal with the economy, restoring jobs, and so on. And that's where Netanyahu doesn't have an upper hand over his rivals. If this situation continues and we get back to the period where you either have 3 weeks to form a government or there's a 5th election, that's when Netanyahu continues to dominate the field with his 30-year experience on the security issue, but also that's where he can rally his base. And so it could have implications, but again, it's still early to be seen, because we can wake up tomorrow morning and a ceasefire is announced and the political negotiations resume, and next week we see a new government form and the calm restored in Israel.
But I also want to point out, I think, one thing, we're going to wrap it up because it's late and we all, the audience and we all probably have stuff to do, including getting the report to bed and the kids. But anyway, one thing we have not talked about enough is the Palestinian situation politically, which Jacob did talk about at the very beginning. But I think that's also relevant to PJ's question, right? Because the Palestinian political situation is much less stable than the instability that we've seen for years. The Palestinian Authority is weaker and weaker in every public opinion poll. So the stark division between the Hamas and the West Bank leadership is growing more and more. And the cancellation of those elections is part of what contributed to some of the heat in the street that was helped fuel this fire, even though it was essentially at the Palestinians' own leadership. President Abbas is way past his own term limit, continued to postpone elections. So I think that is, also a factor in just the general political instability and heat. As PJ indicated with the question. Laura, I'm going to give you the last word, I think.
Oh, man. Look, I think in some ways the Palestinian government's response is similar to the Israeli one, which might sound odd, but both leaderships know that instability can be used to their political advantage to maintain power. And whether you're delaying elections by force or figuring out a political maneuver to build a coalition, we know that instability strengthens incumbents and strengthens the existing political leadership 99 times out of 100.
Thank you for that. And thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks, Jacob. Thanks, Laura, for your wisdom and your insights. And thank you so much to Benjamin Cohen, who's been managing, producing this live stream. Please come back and see us again. We have another live stream scheduled, I believe, for Wednesday on the Pew Report that's coming out. And we're here on forward.com and on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube all the time. So please come back and be with us, and let's all hope that the violence quiets down.